And one last time. Hello everyone and welcome to Work with Purpose, a podcast about the Australian public sector and how it serves the Australian community. I'm your guest host for today, this last episode of Work with Purpose. My name's Kate Driver and I have the privilege of being the CEO of the Institute of Public Administration Australia ACT Division and also the National Division. I am here with the very beginning of our podcast today. And I'm here on Ngunnawal country, where for over 160 episodes and over 35,000 years, people have gathered and had conversations, shared stories and learnings. And so as part of our contribution to the journey of reconciliation, we acknowledge that history, that tradition of storytelling here on Ngunnawal country, paying respects to elders past and present, and also laying the footprints for those who come after us. Now, if you listened to last week's episode, you will have heard our sad news. Work with Purpose is entering a hiatus after 6 successful years as the go-to podcast for Australian public sector conversations. From very humble beginnings during COVID-19, if you can remember those early days of lockdown, to unpacking significant matters like robo-debt, getting close to the public sector's most senior leaders and hearing the stories of those who work on the front lines, this podcast has had no shortage of stories and people who highlight the best of Australian public sector work every day. Now, for those of you that love a good stat, over its life cycle, Work with Purpose has had over 118,000 downloads. We have had over 162 episodes, including some national and international perspectives in addition to those conversations. We've been on 44 different streaming platforms and we have listeners in over 134 countries. So for those of you that think that we're just here in a studio in Canberra talking about the public service, you might be a little mistaken. The work we've talked about and the conversations we've had have had a global impact. Now, what you probably don't know is that Content Group and IPAA ACT have been partners in Work with Purpose from the start. And what you definitely won't know, but listeners, I'm here to share the secrets now. Content Group has wholly supported our podcast on a pro bono basis from day one. They've brought their expertise, their resources, their studio, and their people along on the journey with us because they believe in public sector conversations. And I'd like to thank, before we start the conversation, the support of Content Group, including its founder and CEO, David Pembroke, who of course is the voice of Work with Purpose. So today's final episode, we're turning the microphone around, David. You've sat across over 160 episodes from senior leaders. You've been the voice of the podcast for 6 years, something that not many podcasts do for a 6-year run. We're also going to bring back one of our very first guests. The second episode of Work with Purpose, after we spent the first one introducing what it is we were doing in the depths of lockdown, was Andrew Metcalfe, then Secretary of the Department of Agriculture in the Commonwealth, now IPAA National President, and a number of other things going on in his life as well, which we'll talk about too. And so today I've asked Andrew to have a chat with me and turn the microphone around on you, Pemby, so that we can have a conversation about how the sector has changed since the inception of that podcast, what it's been like to shape the pod itself, and what are the lessons that we've learned and the conversations we've had and, importantly, should continue to have. So welcome, David, and welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Kate.
So thanks, Kate. Great to be here.
Now, David, some of our listeners will have heard the story, but let's go right back to the beginning. Mm-hmm. How did this all start?
Well, you mentioned me as the founder of Content Group, and that's true, but I am only a co-founder with my wife and business partner, Anna, who's been fundamental to the success of Work with Purpose over time. But it was the afternoon when the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, and Greg Hunt, the Health Minister, closed the country. And we were all sitting there watching the press conference from the Prime Minister's alcove up in Parliament House. And we got the news. And as a small business, we were sitting there looking at that, and I'm sure like most other Australians wondering, what does this mean? And later that afternoon, we were both watching Sky News, and there was a particular reporter at the time who was interviewing Greg Hunt, and she wouldn't let him speak. And we were both so irritated by it wasn't the time. It was the time to let the leadership speak. It wasn't the time to interrupt or seek. And so we sat there and discussed it and came up with this idea of saying we need to find a forum for people to be able to speak. And we need to be able to hear from our leaders, not just our political leaders, because we knew that we were going to hear a lot from the political leaders, but we needed to hear from the leaders of the public service so they could explain not only to the public service, but to the Australian people about what was going to take place. Because as you remember, everything was happening at warp speed and on the run. So anyway, Anna and I decided that would be a good thing to do. And over many years at Content Group, we've committed a portion of our profits every year to pro bono activities. And we thought, okay, well, let's invest in a podcast. So I was walking through the Canberra Centre the next morning. As a business owner, I was allowed to come to work, and it was completely empty. And when I came to the office, without a word of a lie, there was a note from Drew Baker, who was then in your position as the CEO of the ACT, saying, call me urgently. And so I rang him, and he said, we're going to need more content. And I said, well, guess what? I've had an idea. And even as I was walking from my car through the Canberra Centre to my desk, I'd already come up with the name Work with Purpose. And so I then rang another distinguished Australian public servant, Jane Madden, and I said to Jane, I said, listen, what do you think? IPAA needs more content. I think that this is a good idea. And we had a quick conversation, and Jane said, go for it. So then I rang Drew back, and we said, okay, let's go for it. So I rang a contact in the Prime Minister's office. He started ringing around, and it would have been probably a week later, we had Peter Woolcott and Catherine Jones sitting in front of our new studio that Ben Curry, who's our technical director here at Content Group, had set up, which we then called Studio 19. And away we went. And that was the conversation. And the whole idea was to really just unpack it and to ask the simple questions and to listen and to allow people like Andrew, like Catherine, like Peter, like Greg Moriarty, just tell us what's happening. And that's where it all started, and away we went.
And thinking about today, I look back at that list of episodes, and even in those early days, what I think was really amazing was the leaders that showed up for that conversation. You've sat across the microphone from Governors General, from ministers, Commonwealth Government secretaries, head of the ACT public sector, directors general, senior leaders, mid-level leaders, people who won a Spirit of Service award at the IPAA ACT Spirit of Service Awards to come and talk about their work. And you can hear them beaming with pride about the thing that they've been recognised for. In all of those conversations, Pemby, what are the things that stand out to you about public sector leadership?
You know, Andrew's a great example of it. You know, someone who has dedicated their professional life to the benefit of the Australian people. That's why they serve in the public sector. And it's why companies like ours, which are private sector, but we serve the public sector as well. And I just think there's a deep commitment to that, and it's meaningful. And most of them are people who could do anything, really. You know, they could pursue any type of career, but they choose and have chosen over many years to be leaders in the public sector, and they're driven by that deep love of the country and of the people, and that's why they do what they do. And you see it in pretty much everyone that we've interviewed. There is a pride in what they do. There is an understanding of the importance of what they do. Now, it's not perfect, of course, but yeah, there's just this commitment that you feel. And when I think back to COVID-19, that's when you really saw the public service at its best, where it was in a crisis. The country was in a crisis. And things that previously couldn't happen, that were impossible, were happening. And they were happening everywhere, and they were happening in all departments, and people were being asked to do all sorts of extraordinary things. And the amount of time that was being collapsed, and the people were going from one job to another job, and they were asked to be doing things that they'd never tried before. But they used their knowledge, their skills, their experiences to, bring together this wonderful response. And again, to see the agility and the adaptability and the power of the Australian Public Service at a time of crisis, that was inspiring in those early days. And to then speak to the leaders who had such clarity and such great commitment. And it was work with purpose, particularly in those early days, was very important, because it was a place where the leadership could speak directly, not only to their own people, but out to the Australian people. And I think that helped to give confidence that we've got this, guys, let's stick to it.
And one of those leaders is back here today to speak to us, Pemby. One of them was in the middle of the eye of the storm in COVID-19 when you were the Secretary of Agriculture at the time. Andrew Metcalfe sitting here now with many hats on, but amongst which is the President of IPAA National now. And Andrew, just to refresh your memory, you were the second episode of Work with Purpose. Really, the first one was introducing what this thing is going to be. So it was really the first substantive leadership conversation. So there's a beautiful full circle moment bringing you back here today. And you spoke about the theme, relationships matter. And when you talked to Pemby during that time, you were talking about leading during uncertainty and turmoil, and really relying on the relationships and the craft that you had built as a public service leader, but also as a person who was trying your best to wrap your arms around people and look after them in a socially distanced way at the time, of course, to really give people a sense of where we were going. You've also been on the other side of the microphone as a guest presenter on a number of these conversations. Andrew, in 6 years, what do you think's changed, and what do you think are the perennial themes that we must keep coming back to?
Oh, big question, Kate. And I must say, just hearing you and David talking about the early days, and particularly COVID, just really took me back to what an extraordinary time it was for all of us. But, for my role then as Secretary of Agriculture, Water and Environment, in bringing together a natural resource management department and having staff who are on the front line at airports and ports, on the front line supporting key businesses such as our export industries for meat processing, and staff who are particularly vulnerable, Indigenous Australian staff in our national parks, Kakadu and Uluru and Budari, and of course Australians living in the most remote place on the planet, in our bases in the Antarctic. And so it's quite poignant thinking back and talking then about relationships mattering, and relationships matter as much as any do today. But just in that 6 years, the pace and change of technological development, I think, is the thing that strikes me the greatest, and the challenges and possibilities facing the public sector, but humanity more generally, being brought by this new industrial revolution that is artificial or augmented intelligence, is quite breathtaking. When you think about the extraordinary knowledge that you can have at your fingertips, but whether that knowledge is reliable and to the purposes to which it might be used are all very important questions. So there are many enduring themes in public service. Relationships and being able to work well and cooperatively and respectfully with people are critical. But probably for me, the most enduring theme is how integrity matters as well. And what we've seen over the last decade are some huge integrity failures. And Robodebt, of course, is the best publicised of them, but there have been others. We've seen the creation of the National Anti-Corruption Commission and some decisions now being made by it. But we've seen just how important people in the public sector, where they're given trust and responsibility for the public's money and for programs to support our communities, how integrity is such an important theme, whether it's through the Commonwealth Government, state, local governments, or bodies that work in the public sector as well. So there's a great deal to reflect upon, but relationships and working cooperatively, but also ensuring standards are adhered to, maintained, and where necessary enforced, are two of the big themes for me.
And perennial themes that come back to that touchstone of the original concept, David, of work with. It wasn't just a brand, was it? It was really a conversation that you wanted to start. And you've had that conversation with some fascinating people. Who are your favourites?
You can't ask me that, Kate. That's like choosing your children. Although, perhaps not favourites, but more's to the focus. And I think if people go back and listen, in engaging with the leadership, when we'd start the conversations, they'd want to start to talk about the work and what they were doing. And I was always very deliberate in saying, no, we'll get to that. But I want to know about you. Tell me about you and tell me your story. And I remember speaking to Brendan Murphy and Caroline Edwards, who were running the health department response. And that is one of the most remarkable interviews you will ever listen to. When you hear the stories that they tell, both their backstories, where they came from and what they did, but then what was going on at the time, it stands the test of time as one of the best interviews that I've ever done. Because I know Ben Curry's sitting with us today, I remember when the microphone stopped on that conversation, it was like, oh my God, what just happened then? This was just one of the most incredible conversations. So the purpose was really to find the people, and it's sort of like, come on, like, give us yourself. And I remember also speaking to Mike Pizzullo the same way, and just tell us about you and where you've come from so people can know about you. And I think that was a really key strength, that we needed to find and see the people. Moriarty and General Campbell as leaders of the Defence Department, to see their partnership and hear their partnership and hear them play off each other in the interview as well, was to give people that insight about the person and their relationship. So I think, again, that was a key part of it before we got to the work, because I think you've got to establish in good interviewing, you've got to listen and you've got to find that emotional connection for the audience. And of course, once they connect to the person, that's when they can then hear and feel the rest of it and the direction and the important stuff. So I think that was, probably Brendan Murphy, Caroline Edwards. That was the most remarkable conversation. And it just, to this day, gives me goosebumps thinking about that particular interview. But that was something else. And I'm just delighted that this body of work now sits as a place for academics and researchers into the future. When they want to know what was happening, they can go back and they can hear and listen and feel what was going on. So it's going to be a real resource, I think, particularly for the public service, when the next crisis perhaps arrives, or in preparation for the next crisis, that it stands the test of time. And it was a simple idea. We've got to make this happen, and let's do it, and let's make it happen. And I think that's one of the benefits that the private sector can bring to the public sector. And I think it's an important theme here, is that not everyone in the private sector is a crook.
No, not at all.
So, of course, at the moment, the way it's presented...
I'm nodding here, David.
There's many of us who are as committed to the public sector as anybody else. And as I say, we've committed a portion of our profits over many years, well in excess of $1 million of time and effort and energy to deliver work with purpose. But that ability to be able to move quickly, that's what we could bring. Now, if someone had tried within the existing arrangements to say, we're going to start a podcast that's going to talk about, it'd still be in committee. They'd still be talking about it. Whereas we were able to come in and go, hey, here's a good idea. How about we do it? And IPAA, again, the role IPAA plays as a speedboat, helping sort of rolling along this giant thing. So IPAA's one side and, private sector is on the other side, helping, this big beast move along. And this is a great example of that collaboration between the private sector, the public sector and, IPAA, to be able to deliver benefit for the Australian people. Because ultimately, that's what we're all here for, is to hopefully make Australia a better country. And that's why we turn up every day. Yeah,
and that's great to hear you talking about IPAA, David, because IPAA, the professional body for public sector workers, Commonwealth State, right across Australia, 2 million people get out of bed every day and go to work and serve their communities as public servants. And overwhelmingly, they want to do a good job. And overwhelmingly, they're doing it for a purpose. And while, of course, it's a job and they get paid for it. So many of those people have chosen to work because they actually identify in wanting to help other Australians in some way. And I think you're absolutely right. This podcast will be an extraordinary time capsule because, frankly, the issues we face, although the circumstances may change, the technologies may change and whatever, ultimately it's about people facing challenging situations, and those human qualities remain the same. And just hearing you talking about Brendan and Caroline, and I was in some of the rooms that they were in at various times. It was a pretty extraordinary time. And frankly, the Australian government and the state and territory governments kept this country safe. The amount of disease in the country was far less than in comparable countries overseas. The extraordinary work done to secure employment and to keep businesses running. In the case I was working in, to keep agricultural goods flowing in and out of the country and across state borders which were being shut, and helping foreign workers come in to help pick the fruit. There are just so many examples. And so that's right, to work with purpose. Lots of people work with purpose, and this is a wonderful way of documenting what's been happening.
And I might just call out another one, and this was to do with robo-debt. A guy by the name of Bevan Hannon, who's the general manager of comms down at Services Australia, was obviously heavily involved in robo-debt. And that was another great interview because it came from Bevan's core, how upset he and many of the people in Services Australia had been by what had taken place and how they'd been so badly let down by some of their leadership who hadn't acted as they needed to. So, yeah. Actually, as we go through, I can think of like Andrew, of course, a very good, and a hail fellow, well met, always a good conversation. So, but every week you would put down the microphone and you'd just think, well, there you go. Isn't that a great story?
Yeah. And
it would reveal another person who, to Andrew's point, is dedicating their professional life to do things for the people. And okay, Andrew's right, they get paid and all the rest of it, but in 99% of the people who've been through the door, they're here because they want to make an impact. And I think that's the great, not that I didn't think it before, but I can tell you that at the end of most interviews, I'd sort of be thinking, how good's this, that this very smart person has decided that they'd like to dedicate their professional life in the best interests of the Australian people. So, yeah, it's been an absolute privilege. And I'm pleased that I had the idea, or we had the idea, Anna and I had the idea, and I'm pleased that, we've been able to deliver it over time.
And it's been a great partnership in that, David. And I think one of the unique things about the conversations we've been able to have and will continue to have, because, of course, Content Group and IPAA intend to continue to work together.
In lockstep, Kate.
We part this podcast as friends, and we're really proud of what we've built together. We've also been in a really unique position because we've been able to have a conversation with the Emperor about their sartorial choices in ways that perhaps those who are employed under specific legislation can't. Now, Andrew, you are right in the middle of these conversations with your various roles. Our most downloaded episode in Work with Purpose was episode number 81, which was Rebuilding Trust and Integrity After Robo-Debt. And that was with Kathy Lee, who was the head of the ACT Public Service and still is, and the then Secretary for APS Reform, Gordon de Brouwer. Now, in your many roles, not only as National President for IPAA, your work with the ANU, your work with the ACT government, you are seeing the conversation around integrity play out in a long way since that conversation. Do you think we're having the right conversations? Do you think we should be having other conversations, and with whom?
Gee, that's an interesting question, Kate. Look, I think we're having the right conversation, but I despair sometimes when I just keep seeing failures in integrity. One of my several roles, as you alluded to, is the Public Sector Standards Commissioner for the ACT government. It's a part-time role, and it's supported by the Professional Standards Unit, a team of about 25, 26 people who work to basically ensure that the code of conduct is adhered to, and when there are complaints that it hasn't been, are able to work through investigations. And I must say, I just despair sometimes at some of the things I see. And of course, I'm also right at the moment the Acting Chancellor of the Australian National University, where again, there have been several external reports showing failures of governance and leadership. And you sort of wonder why, because all the people that I see in these situations are smart people who are dedicated, but something goes wrong, and I'm not quite sure why, and I think that's probably another conversation as well. I think there can be organisational and cultural factors that determine very much how things are done around here in particular workplaces. There are, pressures and stresses on particular individuals. So it's a conversation that we will always have to have, because it's not something you can set and forget. But I do think that there probably need to be more examples of where things go right, and that's something that IPAA is very good at, about celebrating success, and then trying to say, well, what was the magic that made that particular group of people, that particular project go well, and then let's look at where things go wrong, and are there some common factors? There's probably a PhD or 3 or 4 in all of that, and I suspect that's an area that IPAA and hopefully the content group in some way will continue to focus on.
And those conversations, as you mentioned, Andrew, really go to culture and the living, breathing, evolving conversation. So while we're drawing the Work with Purpose podcast in its current iteration to a close and popping it in hiatus, the conversation continues. And one of the things that I'd like to touch on with both of you from different perspectives is the conversations with our emerging and early career leaders, and those leaders who might have just stepped into their first management job. Pemby, you mentioned before that the back catalogue of the podcast gives us an opportunity to work back. And I have to admit, when I was down to the final few for this particular role at IPAA ACT, I listened to the entire back catalogue.
Oh, did you?
And it took me a long time. There was a lot of walks around the block, lots of long drives. But I really enjoyed it because I was able to get in the headspace of something bigger than the current departmental role I was sitting in at the time. So my question for you, Pemby, as a person who is part of a broader ecosystem of public sector, is how do you want to talk to those emerging leaders? And then Andrew, question on notice for you, having just come away from the estimates table recently. Question for you is, what do you think our grads, our early career leaders and those people who have stepped into their very first management role should be thinking around in that culture? But Pemby, I'm going to throw to you first. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I just hope people continue to choose the public sector as a career, and they see it as a viable option, and they see it as a place which is worthy of the application of their knowledge and skills and behaviour and their attitude. And I hope there are many companies who dedicate their resources and efforts and energies to service of the public sector at the moment. So under the current policy of the government, they've decided that they would prefer to work less with the private sector, and they want to build, internal capability, which I think is useful and reasonable and entirely inside the, the purview of the elected government of the day. That's the great system that we have. We have elections and they win and they can do what they want to do. But I do hope that it's not lost of the benefit that the private sector can bring to the public service, and for young people to think that they may be able to serve the Australian people and the public service, not just in the public service, but they can work for civically minded private sector companies who dedicate their efforts to the public service, like Content Group, for example. And I do hope it's not lost that there is benefit. Now, it's, publicity is not great at the moment, and we see these egregious sort of instances where, again, the integrity failures that are happening, not just inside the APS, but inside, some of the bigger private sector companies. And, it makes for bad headlines, and it makes for, a lack of trust and a lack of confidence. And again, I feel, for the younger people who are serving the Australian people through those bigger institutions where they've been horribly let down by their leadership, but they've done nothing, other than, go to work and try to do the right thing. And so I suppose it does go back to leadership in organisations that on both sides, but I just think we don't want to discourage people from making a contribution, be it inside the APS or inside private sector organisations servicing the government, because you need both. And I think perhaps, it had gone too far the other way and there was too much of a reliance on the private sector. But perhaps we've now gone too far the other way in that, there's a lockout almost of, we're not going to deal with them because they're trying to rip us off. And, you read some of the stories and you just think, oh my God, how is it that organisations can behave in that way? So anyway, I suppose the point is, getting back to your point about younger people, I just think whether they serve the public through the private or the public sector, that they be encouraged to keep that ambition of making a contribution to the Australian people, and they get the opportunity in both places.
And it's conversations like we're having today, like we've had over 162 plus episodes, that gets below that media headline, the grabbing attention. We actually lift the lid and have the conversation about what it looks like to have a career in service to our community. It is a choice, it's work with purpose.
Yeah.
And it's something that we are stewards of. We hold for a period of time and we pass on. We're part of a larger institution.
And I do think that if younger people have the opportunity to listen to many of the people who've been featured on the programs, like Andrew Metcalfe, that they would be inspired to a career of public service, because the work is infinitely fascinating. It's like you can't have a boring day. If you're engaged, there are so many interesting things to do, so many interesting problems to get involved in. And that's this aspiration of serving the people and having it as a key part of your being and your purpose, brings real value to people.
And that's absolutely my own personal experience. I was up there in the late 70s doing arts law at Queensland University, thinking that I'll end up being a solicitor and may well be called to the bar. And then I was doing a Australian government administration subject, and I had a lecturer who inspired me to think about the work of public service, and who actually brought in one or two politicians and one or two senior public servants into our lectures, and we were able to just think, wow, there's all these things out there that governments do, and maybe I could be a part of that. And then, back then, there were public service wide training programs for young graduates, and so I was an administrative trainee in 1980 with 30 colleagues. And we didn't just work for one department, we worked across 3 different departments, again to sort of show us the opportunities that existed. Now, that sort of thing doesn't exist anymore. And one of the real issues for me with young public servants is that while there are certainly training opportunities, they tend to be sort of a bit piecemeal depending upon the department. We do now have the APS Academy, which is a wonderful sort of addition. And then in more senior levels, we've got, ANZOG and, and the various universities as well. Bearing in mind that we're now largely a graduate workforce, both Commonwealth and state and territory public service, you are bringing people into service who have tertiary level training, quite often in government or politics or international affairs or whatever it might happen to be. But the real issue is really understanding the craft of public service. And I was very fortunate to have some senior leaders who took an interest in me, and where I was able to take opportunities to move departments and to change and to see different things. And that all was a foundation to what became a long career. But it was all a bit piecemeal and it was all a bit accidental. When I compare the investment that professional services bodies, for example, put into their graduate cohort, and I was a partner in a professional services firm for 6 years along the way, the commitment to training and improvement permeates everything. And I just don't see that in the public sector. I'm not quite sure why, because people are our most valuable asset. And if there's one thing where I hope IPAA can really help bridge that gap, are through the sort of programs and services that we provide back into the public services, because that gaining of knowledge, that gaining of experience, that understanding what's happened in the past, knowing what works well, knowing what hasn't worked well, forming those relationships and those networks are all things in those first 5 or 6 years of a career that will stand you in good stead right through a long career. So.
And it really is a question of investment, not cost. And that investment might take some time to return. Most of our listeners will probably know that if you're in the ACT government or most Commonwealth departments, you've actually got your IPA membership paid for you already as part of your employment arrangements. And that opens up opportunities for networking events. There's a lot of low and no cost activities, as well as a number of really high quality programs that we do in collaboration with our partners like ANZOG and the APS Academy. And we do a lot of conversations with senior leaders. Now, turning the script completely around, Pemby, those conversations with senior leaders almost inevitably come back to very personal attributes of who that person is and where they came from. And you mentioned before that one of the things that you liked to do was ask the question about this story before they had the conversation. Now, today, because I wanted to lull you into a false sense of security and just talk about the content, I haven't asked you that question yet. But Andrew, do you think we should ask him
Find more out about this chap.
Yeah. I mean, what do you reckon his story is?
Yeah,
Why do you think he
how many
donates
hours
this?
have we got, Kate?
Well, yes. I mean, we might have to turn this into a two-parter, but Pemby...
My wife jokes about this because I've got, the long version and the short version. And the long version starts as a paperboy back in the days, rolling around the Mater Hospital in North Sydney, selling newspapers and magazines as a kid. Grew up in Wollstonecraft on the lower North Shore of Sydney. Lucky enough in the late 60s to grow up in Sydney. Went away to boarding school down to Chevalier College in Bowral. Wonderful experience. Back to Sydney. Did a commerce degree at the University of New South Wales with a marketing...
So it turns out that accountants can have conversations?
I did a marketing major.
Oh, right.
So I wasn't an accountant. I was in marketing. And I was lucky enough, my first job out of university was to work in video cassettes and audio cassettes for 3M, Minnesota Mining and Manufacture. Our brand was the Scotch brand. And not only being a paperboy, I also grew up in a hotel. My dad owned a pub, so from a very young age, I was around people. And I was always been interested and fascinated by people. And when you're in a pub, you talk to a lot of people. So from a very young age, I always loved those conversations and trying to understand people. So anyway, one of my great desires, even from a young age, was to be a journalist. And my mother had been a journalist in the 50s, and her son was never going to be a journalist on her watch. So anyway, I fulfilled my parents' wishes to get a good degree and get a job and all those sorts of things. But then I was of age to be able to do what I wanted to do. And I always wanted to be a political correspondent for ABC Radio Current Affairs, AM and PM in the world today. So I left my prospective commercial job and went back into community radio, worked my way up and ultimately got into the ABC. And that's what brought me to Canberra. So I ended up in the press gallery 93 until John Howard was elected in 1996, and one of his first gifts to the Australian people was to put the knife through the ABC. And I was lucky enough to get a voluntary redundancy. And so at that point in time, my father had always encouraged me that when he said to me, whenever you feel like you can start a business, you should, because it's the best way to look after you and your family. So I got the money from my voluntary redundancy, which was the seed capital for what became Content Group. So I did my research. I remember it was just a wonderful period of my life. I had 3 months where I would just sit around in my pajamas all day. I grew a beard, I grew my hair, and I just had this fantastic sort of exploratory, I don't have anywhere to be today. And anyway, in my research, it told us that, one day we would all carry supercomputers in our pockets. We would all be able to create video, audio, stills, text, and graphics. And so it was known as content at the time. And I was like, okay, that's cool. So I started the Content Group back in 1997. And we've been going ever since. And the simple proposition has always been to combine business and journalism skills to tell the stories of our clients so as that they can achieve their business objectives. And that's what we do to this day. And sort of my side hustle is in the sport of rugby union as well. I was lucky enough in 95. I played at a reasonable level when I was a young guy. The coach of my time when I was playing ended up being very successful, came to Canberra, and I was lucky enough to be a founder of the Brumbies. So way back in 1996 was our first season. And I've been heavily involved in the sport ever since. I was a communications director of the Wallabies when we won the World Cup. I was Eddie Jones' advisor through his 30-year career, and to this day I'm still heavily involved in the sport of rugby through another podcast called Rugby Unity, which is now a very influential rugby union podcast around the world. So I think that's about it. Got 3 kids, beautiful wife, and again, to give Anna her recognition and due as a co-founder and supporter of Work with Purpose, because as I say, there's been a fair investment, over $1 million in the 6 years to do this, but we've done it gratefully and happily, and she's been a complete and total supporter of making this contribution. And I know I speak on behalf of everyone at Content Group that we've been delighted to be a part of it. And it will continue, but just at the moment, those profits have been squeezed a little by policies, and so therefore investments can't be made, if you know what I mean. So anyway, as things recover, perhaps we will return one day when the profits return.
And it's one of those opportunities to take stock and reassess.
Yeah.
I mean, back in the depths of the first few weeks of COVID lockdown, when podcasts were a sort of thing, but not really a big thing, you recognised an opportunity to have a different conversation in a more direct way. 6 years on, which there are not a lot of podcasts, if you look through your streaming platform, that have a 6-year run, particularly in the similar format. It's an opportunity for us to reassess and think about that. And then my question actually, Andrew, to you is about that future conversation. So looking back, the depths of COVID, the first substantive conversation we had on this podcast was with you in a different role at a different time. I think the acceleration of change is a point well made, even though COVID feels only a few months ago and it's still with us. It also feels like almost an entire generation has passed. Looking back on those conversations where you've sat on both sides of the microphone, the roles that you play as a steward of integrity and conversations in the public sector in very complex, challenging environments, where do you think the conversations with our current leaders and future leaders should be going?
Oh, I think that I sort of covered a little bit earlier. I think there are some timeless issues, and that is really ensuring that in undertaking our work for governments, but as stewards of the community interest, there are some fundamentals. And frankly, we could do a history podcast and go back to the Northcote-Trevelyan report in the UK in the 19th century, which talked about the public sector, merit principles, non-partisanship, and integrity. And so, great name for a podcast will be Working with Integrity, I think. But then there are always new things. I mentioned earlier that I started out in the public service, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet in 1980. There was one fax machine in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet in 1980, one of those things that went round and round and round. There are no computers. IBM golf ball, typewriters and carbon paper were, how things happened back then. When you advance those 40 years, or 46 years now, world is extraordinarily different. COVID was an accelerator. It changed the way we work and how we thought about work and how we do our work. I can't begin to imagine what the next 40 years will bring. That combination of artificial intelligence, of robotics, of the changes that will have to the way that humans perform work, the way that work is performed, whether that is liberating and ensures that people can do very high-value jobs and jobs that are intrinsically very interesting, or whether it in fact creates a whole range of an underclass who are locked out of the workforce. These are some of the big issues, I think, facing governments, and I'm sure they'll be major issues. You then overlay that with the international security situation, the great powers and the great game that's being played. We're extraordinarily fortunate in Australia, but there are many opportunities and many crosswinds ahead, and that's where having a highly educated, well-informed public service is a key part of our national economy, of our national infrastructure. Able to work with governments regardless of the political persuasion of governments, but able to ensure that governments are getting the very best advice and support, and the people are getting the very best services. So.
Just to answer, or just to move on, in some part of that answer inspires this thought to me anyway, of the absolute necessity of the APS to explain, to tell people what they're doing, why they're doing it, and it's, the coin of the realm where we're moving into this disruptive is trust. So there has to be high degrees of trust. And the way you build trust is by people understanding who you are, what it is you're doing it, and why you're doing it. Now, there's that, traditional tension between, the political end of it and, we're elected and we're the ones who do the talking. But there has to be a balance there somewhere. And this is where I think that we got it right with Work with Purpose, is that we didn't move, like the political decisions were being made over there. That was over, but what does the APS do? And I think it's got to commit to do more in communication, to let people know what the public service does, because there's not enough of it. There's not enough explanation. Now, if you want to mediate that through the third parties of media organisations, well, good luck to you. But the thing is, the great gift of technology is that the factors of media production and distribution have been democratised. You're now in the media business, whether you like it or not. And I think government or the public service needs to talk more about what it does, explain more about what it does and why it does it, so it can build that confidence and trust. Because if it doesn't, it'll just get, nipped away, its reputation will be eroded. And so it needs to find that balance between, how can it push itself to the point of being prominent, and to Andrew's point, so people know and understand this is what the APS's role is and this is what it is doing, and it is worthy of our investment. It is worthy of our time, and it is worthy of our time. But I think sometimes it sort of sits back and doesn't feel like it can go forward. Well, I'd be encouraging that particularly the leaders across the APS is get out there and tell your story, and tell wait till you get told, you'll be told when you've gone too far, and don't get involved in the political stuff, but explain to people what it is that you are doing and why you're doing it and what's available to them. Because again, it's this vast, incredible resource, and I just don't think the Australian people knows enough about the public service.
Yeah, I suspect so many people probably judge the public service on the small sound bites that come out of Senate estimates.
Yeah, of course.
Where
looking evasive.
Where inevitably the questions are tough and they're trying to embarrass the government and whatever. Mm. And that's where I really believe that an organisation like the Institute of Public Administration is able to be that safe place where we are completely non-political and non-partisan, but where public sector leaders can come and share their experiences, can talk about what they do. And so being able to multiply that through processes like this and this particular podcast and whatever has been something that's been incredibly important. Yeah. But Kate, no one's asked me the one question that everyone's been asking me in the last 24 hours, and that is, am I related to Connor Metcalfe? Given that we're recording this the day after the Socceroos' famous win against Turkey.
Disappoint me.
Can you claim it?
I can. I've found out that he comes from Newcastle, New South Wales.
Right.
My father's family comes from Newcastle, New South Wales. And that's good enough for me.
Connor, cousin Andrew is singing your praises across the airways.
Folks, you taught him everything he knows. But wasn't that a great?
Oh,
really?
Oh,
history making.
Yeah.
To beat Turkey.
And Canada is still getting over the fans, the Australian fans. So.
I have a feeling that a few people are in for some very early mornings or late nights in the coming weeks. Well, one of the things that came out of the conversation that in fact, you can't see my face, but I've got a huge grin on my face just hearing the language and the conversation. Some of those touchstones take me back to the beginning. So we started this podcast weeks into lockdown. There was a big pace of technology change. Do you remember Zoom calls? Do you remember using Citrix? Do you remember using BYODs because there wasn't enough laptops? Yep. The pace of change in technology was really overwhelming, and the need for trust and communication was absolutely critical. The need for clarity in leadership and humanness in leadership, the need to come back to those touchstones that are the foundational pillars that our sector is built on. Whether you're working for the ACT government doing municipal services that are so highly tangible and the feedback is direct and potentially often quite brutal, or policy making for nation building, those perennial themes have taken us through over 162 episodes. Now, that work hasn't just come from the people you've been listening to today, and it would be remiss of me on behalf of the IPAA board, the council, our members and our partners in Content Group to call out some of our folks behind the scenes. A special thanks to our wonderful contributors over the years: Julia Ahrens, Ben Curry, Eliza Baker, Sarah Jordan, Alison Keneally, Shannon Green, Azel Lorena, Sarah Hope, Annabelle Fife, Kai Hansen, Chris Skipper, my colleagues Drew Baker and Carolyn Walsh, and of course Anna and David Pembroke, who have started this journey with us. We thank you very much for all of those contributions. And of course to all of the speakers and you, the listeners. It's been a pleasure bringing you Work with Purpose every fortnight for the last 6 years. We're immensely grateful for your support, whether you're listening in Australia or overseas. And so, David, with absolute heartfelt thanks from the colleagues at IPA, let's bring it home. Over to you.
Yeah, well, what do you say? Yeah, thank you, I suppose, ultimately. It's having an idea. And see, this is one of the beauties of when you run your own business. You can have an idea and you can just move and make something happen. And I think when I go back to that conversation with Anna where we're sitting there going, well, let's just do it. Let's make it happen and let's push it through. To then be able to create an environment where we've been able to have these conversations that hopefully, and I'm sure they have, I'm sure we've had a lot of impact around the place. And I think it's created value. And again, I think it's supported the public service, particularly in that early point of COVID. There was a place where people could go on a weekly basis to hear from the leadership. And I think they could connect to them as humans, and then they could take, the guidance and direction, which brought great comfort to them. And then since then, as it's grown, as we've been able to play that role that Andrew said before, that, with IPA, you guys have been able to identify the pulse of where the conversation needed to be. Because again, as the private sector, if we were trying to get the various guests onto the program, they probably wouldn't come and talk to us, but they would come and talk to IPA, which again is another part of that sort of speedboat analogy role that I think, IPA needs to continue to make. But yeah, look, I think it's not goodbye forever. I think we'll come back at some stage. But I would encourage just more, more explanation, more conversation, more understanding, more awareness of the value and the benefit of the public service through the APS, because it is a magnificent institution. And just as we're very proud of the Socceroos, we should be very proud of the APS. So get out there and tell your story, APS. Don't be shy. Let people know who you are and what you do and the contribution that you make. And yeah, we're not going too far. We've got other things to do, other organisations to engage with in different forms. So yeah, I think for the moment we say goodbye. And thanks everyone for tuning in. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's been an absolute privilege. And on behalf of everyone at the Content Group team, straight back at you, Kate, to you, to Drew, Caroline Walsh in her time as the CEO. It's been a great partnership. It was a partnership that was in place well before we started Work with Purpose, and it's a partnership that will extend well beyond. So we're only retiring a part of it. But yeah, and thanks for everyone who said yes to coming onto the show and sharing their stories. It's been great. And it's one of those things that, you look back on and think that was a good thing, and I'm pleased we did it.
Well, I don't think there's anything more to be said. So on behalf of all of us here at Work with Purpose, can I invite you to go back and listen to some of those episodes. The library will remain open and available through the IPAA website. Content Group will continue to support and work with us on a number of fronts. And so I invite you to stay tuned for the next conversation. Put in your Spirit of Service Award nominations. Have conversations like we have started here. But listeners, for the final time, thank you for listening to Work with Purpose, and it's bye for now.